this morning, and what I want to do is tell you a little bit about the research that I've been working on in the last couple of years here at Amherst College, looking at issues of race and class. And I titled the talk, Race and Class in Higher Education, a case study at Amherst College. And you may wonder how I can begin to talk about higher education when we are not typical of most institutions of higher education. We are a well-endowed, residential, highly selective liberal arts school. And yet what I want to argue is that the issues of race and class that are being dealt with on this campus really aren't that different than the race and class issues that are present on other college campuses. And in fact, the same issues, I think, are being played out that are avoided in the larger society. So I think what can be learned here in doing a case study at Amherst College, in fact, does have relevance beyond this college. Now, I want to just set this in terms of the dramatic changes that have occurred at Amherst College in admissions over the last 40 years. We've come a long way from our reputation as an all-white preppy school for rich kids, which is the way one black student here said she'd heard it described. In fact, today, a third of our students are students of color. Over 60% are receiving some kind of financial aid from this college. Amherst College today affords opportunities for social mobility to underrepresented minority students and to students from families with less financial means. In addition, we've created a community here on campus where students have the opportunity to learn from those different from themselves. And I want to quote something that Tony Marks said in 2006. He said, "The fact that we are not all the same is not merely a pleasant aspect of this college, it is an essential strength. We select and gather differences purposefully and at some expense, precisely to build that strength. We build it because we learn more than if we were or behaved as if we were all the same." And he went on to say, "Your differences are also your best gifts to one another." So, we have created a community where students are now quite different from one another, and there are challenges entailed when students are not all alike, differences to be bridged. And it's also possible that students come to this campus, group with cohorts of students just like themselves, and don't learn that much from this diversity that we purposely have built on this campus. And so the two questions that have been the focus of my research in the last couple of years have been, one, what are the challenges that students face on this campus coming to live together in a diverse community? And two, to what extent are students actually learning something from the diversity at this college? So first, let me tell you briefly what I did. I conducted a study of 58 students who were in the class of 2009, and I did this study by following them through their freshman year. So this was the academic year, 2005-2006. The students in my study came from four distinct groups. One group were affluent whites, one were affluent blacks, one were what I've called lower income whites. These were students with high financial need and or limited family education. And the last group was lower income blacks, students with high financial need and or limited family education. I had approximately 15 students in each of these groups, and they were pretty balanced by gender. In the fall, when they arrived as freshmen, all of these students filled out online surveys and were interviewed within the first 3 weeks when classes began. And the focus of my first interviews was on, one, students' previous experiences with and thoughts about race and class, two, how race and class had played out already for them in their first weeks on campus, and finally, what their expectations were about how race and class would play out in the year ahead. Then in the spring, at the end of their freshman year, all these students again filled out online surveys, again were interviewed face-to-face, and the focus of my second interview was much more on how did race and class play out over the course of the academic year? What were the challenges they faced? What, if anything, did they learn from the diversity in the student body? And I also had measures of students' adjustment and well-being on campus. So I have way more findings than I can possibly present this morning. I actually could give you a 2-hour talk and give you more of a flavor for what I found. So I've had to pick and choose. But what I want to do, the way I've organized this, is I want to start out by talking first about some of the learning about racial diversity, and then open it up a little bit for comments and discussion of that, and then move on to some of the challenges that students faced on this campus. So I want to start out with learning from racial diversity, and I want to present this in terms of anecdotes to give you a flavor for some of the kinds of things that students are learning on this campus. And let me start out by saying that, in fact, there's evidence that both blacks and whites are learning from the racial diversity on this campus. It's not particular to one race or the other. So let me give you an example of some of the kinds of learning that occurred. We have a lower-income black student who reported in her interview that she had gone into the common room where students were filling out financial aid forms. And she'd gone in there with a couple black friends and looked around and saw white students in there filling out financial aid forms, and she was totally taken aback. She said, "They're white people on financial aid too?" And she said, "I've learned that not all white people are the rich ones and all black people are the poor ones," because in her experience up to that point in time in the private school that she had attended on scholarship, the scholarship students were the black students and all the whites seemed to be the affluent students. So this complicated her understanding of whites. And then there was the affluent black male who came from the north and had relatives in the south, and his family would go south in the summertime and visit relatives, and he'd found the south to be a very prejudiced place, a place he was not at all comfortable in, said he'd developed more or less a knee-jerk reaction against white Southerners. But on his hall was a white male from the south, and they shared an enormous amount of interest in common and became close friends. And he said, getting to know this other white Southerner, in fact, helped him get past this blanket prejudice about white Southerners. And then there was an affluent black female who talked with great admiration about a white friend who stood up to another white student who told a racist joke. And she said, "A lot of black people think that all white people are racist and that when they're behind closed doors, they just say whatever they want about other races. And this experience shows how it's complex. It's always situational. I guess a lot of times I assume that white people make black jokes and laugh and no one ever stands up and says this is wrong. And there are people that do that." Okay, so those serve as examples. Let me give you some examples of some of the things that whites learned about race. There are many whites that come onto this campus, particularly true for my lower-income white group, who've had almost no previous experience with people of other races. They're coming from all white communities. In my first interview, when I asked about prior experiences with and thoughts about race, and whether there were any advantages that accrued to them because of their race, they had no idea that they'd had any advantage in this society being white. They had not thought about racial issues. And here is a quote from a lower-income white female who made good friends with a black student and said, "Some of the stories that my black friend told me opened my eyes. I think that people say that discrimination is still going on, and I just never witnessed it. But when she was telling me stories about how her family's black and things that have happened to them, I was shocked. I had never known a personal example of something like that. What I did realize was that I was unaware that there are still prejudiced things going on." So this was her welcome to the rest of America, where prejudice and discrimination and racism are rampant. And then there was the affluent white female who really had assumed that the divides between her and someone who was black must be very great, until she made close friends with an affluent black male and realized that his experiences in society had been very similar to hers, and in fact the greater difference was between her experience and some of the lower income white students that she had met, so that race was not the divide that she had imagined it necessarily to be. And then there are numerous examples of whites who came to this campus and met black students who defied some of their stereotypes. And I'll just give you one example of an affluent white male who said, "I didn't necessarily have the thought that blacks weren't smart before, but now I really have proof that they are." So many of these stereotypes, widely held in society, blacks are less intelligent than whites, are implicitly taken in through our socialization. And it's not like he wanted to believe this, but until he was in the classroom and he met black students who were really smart, he had no reason to give up that prejudice. So these are merely meant as examples. But one thing I think you can see from all these examples is that some of this learning is occurring because of the personal connection, because they're getting to know another student who is of a different race, and it is complicating the more narrow perspective that they had on members of that race. And so what I did is I asked students the extent to which they had formed friendships across race. So one question I asked to black students was, "Have you gotten to know two or more white students well?" And all but one of the black students in my study said yes, they had gotten to know two or more white students well on this campus. And then I asked the same question to the white students. "Have you gotten to know two or more black students well?" And I found a very large class difference. And what you've got here is essentially among the affluent whites, just over half, 54%, are saying, this is right over here, that they've gotten to know two or more blacks well. But you've got almost, 93% here. Almost all the lower-income whites are saying they got to know two or more whites well. Now, you can't explain that statistically because They have equal access to the black students on this campus, and yet one group is forming more relationships than the other. And then I asked this question in a slightly different way. I said, how many close friends do you have? And people differ at the end of the year. I mean, some people say, you know, in terms of who they consider to be a close friend, some people give a larger number, some people give a smaller number. But then I followed that question up with, of those close friends that you just said how many you have, how many of them are of your same race? And essentially, I've got the same result here that you have before when I asked this to whites. This is white students. So on average, 80% of their close friends are white. But for the lower income whites, just over half of their close friends are white. So it's essentially the same result here. So let me show you one more slide and then talk about what all this means. And this is when I asked black students the same question. You know, how many close friends you have? Of those, how many are your race? And I've got a large class difference, but it's the opposite. So in this case, for affluent blacks, whereas the affluent whites surrounded themselves primarily with whites, the affluent blacks surround themselves with mostly non-whites. And it's the lower income group of blacks who have more friends who cross race. So let me just talk a little bit about what does all this mean? I mean, let me talk first about the data I have here for blacks, because one of the things that happens on this campus is people walk into Valentine Hall and they see tables of blacks sitting together, or they walk onto the quad and they'll see a group of black friends sitting together. Beverly Tatum, who's now president of Spelman, wrote a book, Why Are All the Blacks Kids Sitting Together in the Dining Hall? Because if you go to this college campus and any other college campus and most high schools, you'll see the tables of black kids sitting together. And what she said is, no one's commenting on the tables of whites sitting together. People are concerned and worry that the blacks come here and self-segregate. But if you actually look at this data, what the data says is it is possible that blacks could come to this campus and make their close friends completely out of the group of black students here. That is a possibility, but that's not what's happening. And in fact, if you look at this group of affluent blacks here, one reason that this mean is so low is that almost 40% of the students in that group said they had no closest friends who were black. So, you know, there's a lot of variability within these groups, and some people will surround themselves with primarily black friends and some with very few black friends. So it is a complete, I think, misperception when people would, you know, come to the campus, look in the dining hall and say, oh, the blacks self-segregate on this campus. There is much more mixing on the part of blacks than that. Okay, what about the data I have, the class differences for whites? How do you explain that? Well, I'll give you my three explanations. One, it's easier for affluent whites to come here and surround themselves with people like themselves from the same cohort because there are just more of them. That was the group that was the largest group of my four groups. There aren't as many members of these other three groups on campus as there are affluent whites. So, and people tend to, psychologists have found, make friends who are similar to themselves. So it's just easier for that group to make friends with people similar to themselves. It's harder for the lower income whites. They can't find each other easily. They're often mistaken as affluent students because there's such a widespread assumption that whites are affluent. So they don't know who each other are. Black students know who each other are, and many talked about befriending one another in the early weeks because they thought, here's another student who might understand what I'm experiencing and support me. But the lower income students can't do that. So they need to reach out across race lines to make friends out of their comfort zones. And some of them actually said they more readily found similarities with people of a different race who shared their social class background than they did with some of the wealthier white students. But let me put forth one other possibility. And this comes from one student in my study who came from an all-white community, a rural area, fairly racist. Nigger was used frequently, and we're talking about black people. There were no black people. That's how people talked in her community. She told me in her first interview how she sat down in Valentine Hall and several non-whites sat down at the table with her and she couldn't speak. She was so socially anxious she had no idea how to talk to people who were different from her. But she said in her first interview, I definitely want to be very open and I want to meet people who are different from me. I mean, that's why I'm here. I want to see the diversity in action. I want to be part of that. I want to go out of my way to make friends who were different from me. And in fact, she did. She made very close black friends. She learned an enormous amount. Would that we could bottle her enthusiasm for diversity here in terms of learning. And I don't know. I mean, I could only speculate about whether there are less affluent students, white students coming to this campus that share the same enthusiasm for this part of what Amherst College has to offer. I can't say for certain. Okay, so let me move on to some of the learning about social class. And again, just as there is learning from blacks and whites about race, there's also learning by affluent students and lower income students about social class. Let me just start out by some of the learning from the lower income students. Many lower income students come to this campus actually with some prejudices about very wealthy people as entitled, arrogant, flaunting their wealth kinds of people, and have some of those notions challenged and changed. A lower income white female learned that her affluent friends still had to work in high school and were given things but weren't spoiled or expecting I should have this, which based on the little experience I had had was definitely an assumption I had, which I don't anymore. And then there was a lower income black female who said, the stereotypes I've held are changing, that not all really wealthy people are bad or selfish. I'm starting to see that it's a much more complicated issue than, why are you whining? You're wealthy, you don't have anything to whine about. That's not true. I'm starting to figure out everyone has problems. Problems aren't to be devalued based on your social class. It's nice to have that happen. And then from the other end of the class spectrum, there are many affluent students who, because of their encounter with lower income students, for the first time came to see that they had come from very encapsulated communities. And really, as one student from a suburb of New York, a wealthy suburb, said, she realized she had grown up in a bubble and hadn't really been able to see outside of that bubble, because when in her community, her family had a single house, but a lot of her friends' families had 3 or 4 houses, as she put it, one for every season. And so she grew up feeling kind of poor. That's how she thought of herself. She was kind of poor. She couldn't keep up with her friends. But then she got to Amherst College and became very close with some lower income students. And it was like her eyes were open, that she, in fact, was quite privileged, that she had an enormous amount. But she had no understanding of that before she got here. And I had many affluent students who this was their realization, that they had not really seen outside of their either privileged high schools, private high schools that they'd attended, that they had been very insulated from the rest of society. And one affluent black female said she came to realize people like this do exist, people who might be living paycheck to paycheck. She'd never met anyone like that. Or another affluent student, who had a very low-income roommate, and as that roommate told about his experiences in society, he came again to see, he said, I've never really had to think about that. It does open your eyes to what's out there. So it's not like they haven't read about, not everyone shares the wealth that they have, but it was, again, this personal encounter with people who came from backgrounds very different than their own. And the other thing I'd say in terms of some of the learning that's going on about social class had to do with recognizing communalities, common humanity across class lines. That many people, came in thinking this was really a great divide, and it is a divide. But one of the lower income blacks said, he's come to realize that wealthy people, they're just normal people. A lot of them are very similar to me. It's just that they happen to have more money. And this is almost exactly the words that were used in an earlier study I did by a lower-income white student who said he came to realize finally at Amherst College that rich people were just poor people with money. I mean, he could see the similarity. And there were many comments. I'll read you one more. People aren't that different based on social class. It doesn't have as much influence as sometimes you'd expect it to have. So there was, by having opportunities to interact together, to get to know people who are different, people were really, coming to see, so the common humanity, the connections. Now, again, how does this learning take place? I asked students the same question. How many close friends do you have? Of those friends, how many are the same social class as yourself? And what you see is here, about half. About half of the friends are the same social class and half are another social class. But the thing to take a look at here is the two ends here. You've got affluent blacks surrounding themselves the most with people of the same social class, and the lower income white students the least. And if you hold that in mind, I want to show you the next slide, which talks about how much students feel they learned about social class from the diversity on this campus. And you'll see the correlation here, because in fact the affluent blacks, who are the group that surrounded themselves most with people of their same social class, said they learned the least from about social class while they were here. And the lower income whites, the group that had the most friends of a different class, also says they learned the most. So there seems to be a direct relationship, and this is true about race, and it was true for class, that the formation of these personal relationships is important. And I want to say one other thing, because if you look at this slide, you'll see that The means are higher here in terms of what students are reporting they learned from class-based diversity than they were for race-based diversity. And I think this is an important finding because a lot of previous research has looked at the merits of having race-conscious admission and what people learn from racial diversity. And there hasn't been that much work done looking at an educational argument for why you might want class-based diversity on a campus. Most of the arguments have been, why should Amherst College serve to reproduce social advantage? Why shouldn't it, be more concerned about equity and social justice and promoting social mobility? So that is one argument. But there is another argument here, which is what the potential educational benefits are of having a more diverse student body in terms of class, beyond promoting opportunities, which are totally important for social mobility. I think that's a second thing. So, what I want to do at this moment is take 5 minutes. I mean, I wish we had a little more time and we started late, but take 5 minutes to just get some reactions to some of this data and pose, besides reactions, the following question, which is, it is not Amherst College's mission. It's not in our mission statement to educate people about race and class. We haven't privileged that particular domain of learning. But my question would be, should we be doing more as a college in any way to promote this kind of learning? We have more potential here than is being realized. So the question is, should we be doing anything else? So any comments on any of that, reactions? Okay, so let me start with you.
How did you define it more?
Okay, these are people who did not ask for any aid and were not getting any aid. So that group is quite broad. I mean, it goes from people who actually applied for aid and were found not to qualify, but whatever our criteria are, all the way up to people who are extremely wealthy. Yes?
Two questions. Did you make a distinction between Black Americans and African Americans, like first generation African Americans? And the second is, among the groups that were able to connect more with other economic or racial groups, was there a particular way that was successful in doing so?
Okay, well, in terms of who was black in my study, on the admissions form, there's you get to check the little boxes, and one of them says Black African American. It's I'm not sure exactly what else. It's kind of Black African American something. Maybe there's one other thing there, and then there's another one that says mixed. Anyone who said mixed is not in the study.
I'm not suggesting white and black.
No. So, but white. But then I asked them in their interviews, how do we've got, it's a mix. That group is a mix of people who, I said, how do you define yourself? Some said black, some said African American, some said Caribbean American, and some were a mix. I mean, they considered themselves black, but they were a mix of all kinds of mixes. So between who says I'm black as opposed to I'm African American?
What their experience was.
Yes, okay.
Immigrant,
right.
Having a different experience for people who have been
right.
raised here.
Right. That I can't talk about that because the numbers get too small when you break it down. How many came from those different backgrounds? I mean, I can't talk about that. It's too small. Yeah.
Did you look at all at the effect of in class? I'm
talking
yes. about academic, not social plastic. In class experiences.
Yes, I did.
In their attitude.
Yeah. Well, what I did. Okay, so I did look at what's called classroom diversity, whether people took courses having to do with race and class, and whether they benefited from having a diverse set of peers in the classroom. And I don't have, it's one of the things that unfortunately got caught when I was putting this stuff together. But one, blacks take more courses having to do with blacks in Africa and race than whites do. Lower income students take more courses that dealt with class issues than affluent students do. But there was a lot of evidence that students benefited, by hearing comments from someone different from themselves in the classroom, that some of those comments carried way more weight than the reading might have had. I mean, yes, in terms of the classroom experience, there was a lot of evidence, that there's important learning. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned there was quite some distribution of different experiences. What proportion of the students really didn't learn anything about social class or didn't make any friends?
Right. Well, yeah. The thing is, so I actually reported some numbers in the book. Some people learned something. They said, I learned something about race here, but nothing about class. Some people, I learned something about class, but nothing about race. Some people say, I learned something about race and class. And when you put them all and some people, I learned something in from the classroom experience as opposed to. So if you put that all together, the numbers are fairly high. If you look at any one of them singly, they're low. If you put them, together, there's more learning than you think.
But if you turn it on its head and say
Yeah.
there's a vulnerable group who really didn't,
Yes,
cross-
there are.
who didn't
Yep.
step out of their comfort
Yep.
zone.
That's right.
What proportion would you put in that category?
Well, I mean, the thing is, the group that reported the least learning on this campus were the affluent white group. So I don't know if does someone want to respond to that? Why you were going to? Would someone? Okay, let me say. Would someone be willing to speak to that?
Just that if almost social pressure now is to say that you did learn something from this. Somebody comes in and all they're hearing is saying this diversity is a really great idea, and then you ask somebody, did you learn anything from this? Do you have any friends of a different race? They go, yeah, I've got friends of a different race.
Why are the numbers so low?
But
The social pressure, I agree. The social desirability response is, yep, I do. But then the numbers are pretty low on race.
my question was, when you asked the question, was the question back? I mean, did you say, can you give me the names?
Yes. No. Actually, the question about some of this data is coming from my online survey, and some of it's coming from the interviews. The data on how many close friends do you have was in the online survey. Question: how many close friends do you have? Of these friends, how many are your race? How many are your class? I didn't name them, but so that was the some of the data is coming out of the actual interviews. So I'm drawn from both sets of information. Yeah.
Can you be a little more specific in defining the affluent white population? Were they Catholic, Jewish?
Everything. I have, the span of religions. I have data on that, but it's a span. See, here's the thing. When you've got, first of all, my sample is as big as it could possibly be on this campus, because in that class there were 42, I can't remember, it was 42 or 44 black students coming in. So in fact, in my study, I have the majority of black students in the class of 2009 in my study, But so that set the size of my study. I couldn't have groups of 30 because we don't have 30 people, to be in each of these groups if you look at a single class here. I mean, given the size of Amherst College. And therefore, there are many questions when you get down to how does it, and that's what some of your questions are. Well, how do we break this down? And what is the difference between, and these are important questions. What's the difference between like a black student who's coming in from an all-black neighborhood as opposed to a black student who's coming in from, a predominantly white neighborhood or who's been to this kind of school or that kind of school or is first generation, I can't answer, so this is meant to be a conversation starter and not definitive answers. Here's some questions we ought to be asking ourselves. But yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Yes, no Asians, no Latinos, no. I mean, I focused this. I felt that the biggest differences were going to be black and white, and that's what I went for, as opposed to saying I could have done this Asian, white, Latino. I actually had an honor student who did some aspects of this, who was Latino and was interested in the experience of Latino students, and looked at some of the questions I looked at in terms of Latino students. But yeah,
There were two questions. The first one is that it seems like the wider the experience, the more they learn.
Yes.
The closer the bubble,
Yes.
the less they learn about other people.
yes.
Did you get into any of the whys as far as why affluent blacks chose not to associate with lower income blacks?
Well, I'll get into that. Okay, so I'm going to move forward, and I'm going to answer that a little bit in the second half of the talk. Okay, so let me move forward and talking about some of the challenges that students are facing on this campus. And let me start this time. Let me start with some of the challenges that they face in terms of social class. I mean, there certainly are moments on this campus where lower income students feel like outsiders to a culture of shared wealth. And one of those moments is when they arrive here and students move their extensive and expensive possessions into the dormitories. And, students talked about the electronics. It's the flat screen TVs, plasma TVs, students brought computers. They all brought computers. But whether they brought the laptop computers or the less expensive desktop computers, all the way down to the little iPods. And then there's also all the clothing and accessories. I mean, some students said, talked about, my gosh, my roommate filled both closets. I've seen more clothes here than I've owned in my entire lifetime. More wealth here, straight up, more wealth than I ever imagined was possible. Okay, and then it's beyond the differences in the clothing or the possessions. It goes on to the differences in cultural capital. What are the conversations about when they first get here? And a lower-income white student said, "I've noticed a lot of people here are very well-traveled. You know, when I was in Europe last summer, we did this. I'm just like, wow, I really haven't done very much. And so it makes me feel very uncultured because I haven't gone to see Broadway plays or gone to this or that or traveled around or anything. I think in my interactions with people, I'm always very conscious of how I'm fitting into this and what do they think of me. I always wonder if people know that I'm different from them." Okay, and then, you know, beyond that, there's the social capital, the networks of friends that some of the affluent students come to this campus and already, because of their private high schools, know some people who are here, or because of the summer camps that they've gone to, and particularly this is true of East Coast people or other extracurricular programs. They have a network of people they're connected to, whereas a lower-income student said in his first interview, "Who knows anyone when they get to college? I didn't know anyone might know someone when they got here." You know, so they're much more alone to make their way. And then there are obviously moments during the year where these issues become very prominent, and lower-income students may feel somewhat excluded or like outsiders. And one of them is around the school breaks, where over intersession in January or over spring break, some of the affluent students are off with their families to warmer climates on vacations to Hawaii or to, you know, the Caribbean. Or there's students organizing trips. One student spoke about someone on the hall who invited everyone to visit his family and relatives in India over spring break, and lots of students jumped at the chance, you know, and their parents footed the bill because this is an incredible educational opportunity. But obviously they couldn't go, or there were the trips being organized. One student talked about a trip to the Bahamas, you know, where obviously they didn't have families who could put up the money for that kind of experience. So there are those moments, but it's also the eating out and the ordering food in. I mean, some of the lower-income students were astonished at how frequently some wealthy students on this campus eat off campus and don't eat in Valentine, or order food into the dorm. And, you know, again, these are things that they can do sometimes, but they don't have unlimited money to spend. And so it's always for them wrestling a choice. You know, well, I might have to work. I could do this. I could go out to dinner. I could actually order less or just order a Coke, you know, or but I have to weigh that against how many more hours I might have to work or what else I'm not going to do. So when things come up like, let's go hear a concert in Boston, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, the cost of transportation, the cost of that ticket, how can I do that? So there certainly are moments that, you know, of exclusion. But one of the issues that I think was particularly interesting to me, and this is something that they hadn't anticipated, was the dislocation that is going on with families at home and home communities and friends at home by coming to this campus. That in a sense, the education we're offering and the social mobility it offers is a double-edged sword. And one of the questions I asked them, do you feel like you're juggling two very different worlds, the world at home and the world at Amherst College? And a third of the lower-income students, I mean, these are the first two groups, these are lower-income students, a third of them basically are saying yes. And almost no affluent students are saying that they really feel that they're two different worlds that they're bridging, two different cultures that they're bridging. And one thing is, for the lower-income students, during the year, they're less likely to be able to go home for family events, and their parents are less likely to be able to come to campus because they can't afford it. And I mean, I imagine that this weekend, family weekend, you know, there will be more parents of affluent students who are able to make their way to this campus than there are families of lower-income students because they can't afford to make the trip. But beyond that, when they go home, you know, lower-income students talked about people not being interested, family or friends being interested in hearing about the books that they were reading, that they were excited about, and the papers they were writing, and the ideas that they were thinking about. That's not what the conversation was about. And if they told their old friends about exciting opportunities here and what they were doing, their friends really felt that they were becoming arrogant and outsiders. And they began, they struggled against being more judgmental of home communities. And yet, I want to read you two quotes. One is from a student who came here and said, from a rural community that was fairly racist, she said, I feel like I've been dropped on Mars. I mean, that's how she felt about arriving here. And then, looking back at the end of the year, she said, when I first got here, I mean, this is a rural farming community. I was more proud of the people at home, just the way that they got by and could make things work and didn't have a lot of outside help. As I've gone through the year, I've turned to seeing people at home as being more close-minded, more judgmental of people. When I go home, it's a completely different world. It's completely different. It's like going back in time. It's completely white. It's completely isolated. It's completely ignorant of the outside world. And then there's another lower-income white student from New England who went home during January intercession, and he said, I noticed the country bumpkin people. I went to get a haircut at this place, and the people there were really the stereotype. Not country, but ignorant in their opinions. They're not knowledgeable. That wasn't something I noticed before. I knew I was from a place like that, but I hadn't felt it so strongly. It didn't make me feel good. How much I noticed the difference. The first week I was home, I was really uncomfortable being in that community. I was worried that this place, meaning Amherst, was changing me too much. And this is only the end of the first year. They hadn't even been home for the summer yet. But what I imagine is that this is a gulf that is going, only dividing. I had one lower-income white male saying, I can't, where basically many of these students, they're the only one that have gone out of state. Everyone else has been left in the same place that they left him, and yet the students that came here, their lives are moving on in different directions. And he was saying, I can't imagine, going back, and these people are still working in the mill. And I'm now off on a job in New York where I may end up at the end of 4 years. This gulf may be even greater. So I'm going to wait till the end, or I'll never get to the end. So let me just get to the end, and then we'll. So at any rate, I think this is a major issue. My plan for the spring semester is I'm going to be following up all these kids again. Now this is a class of 2009. They're going, they've been here now for 4 years, and one of the things I'm really interested in now is I've only got the first year, but looking back, students are much more sophisticated, even about what they said, what they reported as freshmen. They may see some of that differently, and how things have come out at the end of 4 years. Okay, so let me just move on to some of the challenges for black students and then leave the rest of the time for discussion, because there are many challenges that blacks face on this campus. And one of it has to do with racial stereotyping. One of the questions, obviously, this is another thing about, the question came up earlier about, kind of social desirability responses. If you ask someone, have you learned anything from diversity, the right answer is, yes, I have, Well, the same thing, if you say, do you think blacks are less intelligent than whites? Everyone will say, no, of course not. Do you think they're better athletes than whites? No, of course not. So that's not how I asked the question. What I asked students was, do you feel that people have ever made assumptions here about you based on your race, or people of your race that you feel are incorrect? And out came all the stereotypes. Yes, people assume I must be a great athlete because I'm black. I must be able to run faster. People assume, there was a lot of, people assume that blacks are less intelligent than whites, corollary being that you only got in here because you're black and not because you were equally intelligent. And that one, I think, runs deep and hits hard, where we welcome in students and then call into question whether they merit their place here. So, there are certainly stereotypes that they, have to face. Blacks are also put on the spot in the classroom. When the topic turns to race, to speak for blacks. No black person, there's such a range of blacks and black experience, no black person can possibly speak for blacks, and yet all eyes turn to them. They feel very uncomfortable. One lower-income black, who was a Caribbean American, said, don't look at me to tell you about the African American experience. I'm an immigrant. I don't know anything about it just because I have black skin. Don't look at me, Or affluent black is supposed to tell you about life in the inner city. This has not been their experience. So, but that's what happens all the time. Eyes turn to them to, speak for their race. Then there is the complicated issue of how do you respond when there are racially offensive comments? Because these comments do come up, and people use racially offensive terms. The word nigger's used, and how does a black student respond? Or a racist joke is told. Or one student talked about, someone talking about, the people in Africa who are savages. And, so they're offended by these comments. So they said, well, they didn't actually see a good way to respond, because one response would be to get angry, because they do feel angry about these comments. But if you get angry, they said, two things. One, you violated the norms of the academy, where we're supposed to be having rational discourse. We're not supposed to be yelling at each other and getting angry at each other. We're supposed to be able to dispassionately discuss things. But beyond that, they said, and then if I get angry, I fulfilled white stereotypes of the militant, angry black person who's going to make whites feel like they're all racist and bad people. And I don't want to be that person, that Malcolm X or that, Black Panther. That's not the person I want to be. And further, it's likely that this isn't going to come to a good outcome. If it's possible that these two students will kind of part ways as opposed to negotiate their differences. So another option is you don't say anything. The comment comes up, the racist joke is told, people refer to blacks as niggers, and you kind of keep the interaction going and walk away, talk to your black friends later about, oh my God, do you know what happened today? But the problem with that is, one, the white student has learned nothing. The white student has no idea that they have offended and will likely repeat this. Again, there's no learning that's occurred. For the black student, they said a wall has gone up with this white student. This relationship will go no further. It doesn't mean something superficial won't keep occurring with this other student, but there is no more trust. A wall has gone up, and nothing has been negotiated. They're not going to end up at a better place. So then they saw a third option. And the third option was, you step back and you're the bigger person here. What you do is you say, and some of the blacks really came in here with a certain enthusiasm for this, like, I'm going to be the educator, and, took the stance of, whites are ignorant. They were raised this way. They can't help it. Maybe if they told this joke at dinner at home, everybody laughed and thought it was really funny. And now I've got to educate them that this isn't really funny. And, so I kind of have to be the bigger person here. But ultimately, at the end of the year, some of them are saying, this gets wearisome. Why is it that we're responsible for educating whites all the time and they don't have some responsibility for educating themselves? So they didn't see a good way out of this for themselves. And then I think one of the most, complicated things that came up is the incredible diversity among blacks. This is a very heterogeneous group on this campus, and I think often whites kind of fail to appreciate or understand that. I've written a whole chapter in the book, looking at, kind of issues that black students are struggling with on this campus, and part of that chapter is really devoted to differences among black students. And whoever brought up this question about, bridging differences across social class among blacks here. One of the affluent blacks said, I've had a hard time connecting to some of the lower-income blacks because they call me a sellout, and they're not very accepting. So these are differences that have to be negotiated, and they're differences in skin tone. Where a lower-income black said, well, my blackness has been questioned by another black friend who's dark-skinned, who tells me, how could I possibly understand what it means to be black when I'm light-skinned, and light-skinned blacks have a very different experience in this society than dark-skinned blacks do, and, different privileges accrue based on skin tone. So there are tensions to be negotiated around that. And there are tensions to be negotiated around how centrally you place race in your own identity. Is this highly salient to who you are and how you define yourself and the groups you join and the activities you want to be part of? Or is it less salient and you define yourself around other things? And there are blacks for whom it was not highly salient, their race, and were not interested in joining the Black Student Union and felt very uncomfortable just at the number of invitations they were receiving to join black groups, hang out with blacks, because that wasn't who they wanted to spend their time with or how they wanted to spend their time. But how do they negotiate this difference? And there are differences in students' feelings about whether you can date people of the same race exclusively or you can date people of other races. And that created tensions within the community about interracial dating and different views about interracial dating. And there are differences between Caribbean, immigrants and between African Americans and between Africans. So on and on. These are many differences to be negotiated. And, if you go back to the 70s when campuses like Amherst began taking in black students, these differences existed, but there was so much problem with what happened on these campuses and the need for black studies course and the need for cultural organizations and all the rest that they banded together, more easily across differences to fight the white authorities and try to press for change. But, these things have happened. We have a black studies department. We have, it's not like everything's perfect. We have a multicultural center. We have, the Charles Drew House. We have many things in place now. And so now these differences are more prominent. And we bring in black students, and I feel like give them very little help in negotiating these differences. Again, there's potential. These are challenges they face, and there aren't always ways that they are coping as successfully as they might with some of these differences. Okay, but let me just say one thing, because I've talked about some of the challenges. I had measures at the end of the year that looked at students' ratings of, now again, it's all self-reports, their social lives. How good do you feel about your social life here? About their feelings of inclusion and acceptance with peers here. Their feelings of psychological well-being. The extent to which they found they fit in at Amherst, found their place here, grew as a person. There were no race differences. There were no class differences. So across the groups, there are individual differences on how people are faring him. But basically, the means on all these measures are quite positive in terms of how students were feeling about their experience on campus. And these groups did not differ by race and class about whether they had a positive experience here and had found their place on campus and were doing well. So the evidence is fairly strong that despite the many greater challenges, and actually let me just throw one more in about black students because I realize I left out, but I think is also an interesting one, that they have to bridge is moving between groups of blacks and groups of whites, which is not something where many of them felt like they're almost like two different people. I just want to read you one more quote that I think is quite interesting in terms of a challenge, but that is, an affluent black male said, "If I'm with a bunch of black guys, I act more black. And then, if I'm with a bunch of white people, I act more white. I seem to find that I can definitely identify with each race better if I acclimate to their kinds of speech and music and different trends. I'm kind of like a chameleon." So, so this is like an additional issue that blacks are struggling with as they move between a black family and, a white world here and, blacks on campus, whites on campus. Okay. So, now we've got 10 minutes, I think. Okay. So I don't want it to all be question and answer because, if you are, there's so many more details about what I did and how I did it in the book. But what I would like to do with some of our time is focus on one, should Amherst be doing more now in terms of helping students deal with the challenges that they face on this campus? We've done an amazing job at the level of admissions in bringing in students from different backgrounds, both by race and class. I started teaching here in 1975. My first classroom in 1975, Psych 11, had 20 students in it, 19 white males and 1 white female. And, I had the incredible privilege last fall. I teach a freshman seminar called Growing Up in America. I had, out of my 16 students, 8 black students, and maybe I had 1 white male, and the rest were, Latino, Asian. I had this incredible mix of students, and I said that class in particular was a privilege. They're all great because every year I've got a mix, but that one was unique. I've never been in a classroom like this because there were so many black students who disagreed with each other and were, in this discussion that everyone would know immediately, no black people think one thing. It was really kind of a privilege to be in that classroom and have whites and blacks, because we talk a lot in that class about race and class, and, to have that discussion. I'm a complete believer in particularly being located in the discipline of psychology. My classroom has been so enriched by the mix of people as we're dealing, I'm teaching about issues of race and class. And likewise, my research for the first 20 years was about gender, and having men and women here has been definitely a plus for that. So anyway, but so the question is, does the institution, we've invited people who are different in here, does the institution have to change more? Do we have to do other things to create greater learning, to support students who are bringing in any of those things? I open it up to you. Comments? Yes.
2 things. One, I think we should be more purposeful. The question is how to do it and not so it's not artificial. I would like to make ask another question or comment.
Yes.
That it is difficult, and I find it in the language you use, language is so important, that in the title it's race and class.
Uh-huh.
But in your categories, you quickly will substitute income for class.
Mm-hmm.
And the word class is so loaded in our society that, so it's a complex, sensitive topic. And I'll give you one illustration in my own experience here.
Do people hear? I don't know if you can use the microphone if you want.
I had one experience here that was very telling on this subject, and it shows how complex it is. A couple years ago, I had lunch with 2 students who I knew from Chicago, and so it was this older white guy, affluent, but first-generation college goer. When I came here, I'd never been on an airplane. Okay? So lower class, basically.
Right.
And the 2 students I was meeting with were, and who I'd known some. One was a black female who was affluent, 4th-generation college goer. Grandfather, tenured faculty at the University of Chicago. Mother, senior advisor to Barack Obama. The black male, low income, first generation father living in Section 8 housing in Chicago, and he's working on campus to, I get emotional talking about it, to send money home to his mother. Right? So there's a complex situation where who's of what class, who's of what income level. And so, here are the two guys in the situation. Me, in some respects, starting out as lower class, and the black male, lower class, and the white female, upper class. So, the question of using those terms and negotiating that language.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And
one thing I do is I did look at parental education. First of all, I don't even know what their incomes are. I didn't even ask them because a lot of kids, especially affluent kids, have no idea what their parents' income is. So, the number. I mean, they can't even give you a number. But the lower income kids are more likely to know because they've had to fill out all these financial aid forms. But I did ask about educational background, and I asked not only whether their parents went to college, but whether what college they attended. And in terms of these groups, for the affluent students, they all. In fact, almost 80-some% of them had parents who'd gone not just through college but through graduate school. They were highly educated. And when I looked at the nature of the colleges, if you take U.S. News Report and look at whether these are on the list of the top 50, yes. So they're highly educated. I also looked at their occupations. I mean, there's a big difference in jobs. But when you get to the lower income students, okay. For the lower-income whites, I think 2/3 of them were first-generation college students. Their parents had not gone to college. The blacks actually were more likely to have a parent who had gone to college, but the discrepancies between the two parents were often great. Sometimes the other parent had never gone beyond high school. So you've got, in terms of education, you would look at the two parents. If there were two parents, there's sometimes great discrepancies in the education. And often they had not gone to the 50 top colleges in America, and often it had not been a residential experience. They could have gone back later in life, taken courses, finished a college degree. And then there's the whole notion of cultural capital. I mean, this is have been to Broadway plays and into the museums and traveled the world. I mean, and there are real differences, in terms of that also are a piece of social class and how it plays out in terms of the experience on campus. I agree with you completely. And the other thing that becomes complicated, we had in my sample, lower income student who's an immigrant whose parents were highly educated but came to this country and are now working low income jobs, or students. I mean, this is something I do talk about in the book where, somebody whose family was very wealthy and loses all their money, but in some ways, retains the cultural capital, but doesn't have the income anymore, or the person who has the education and once had the income, but comes to America. It is really complicated. I agree with you completely, and I do talk about this in the book some, when I define, for ease of identification, this talk I've kind of lower income, but it isn't just income, and, and some of these things definitely correlate. But yes, and what's, one thing about being upwardly mobile is, yes, you're going to have people who come from, some of these lower income backgrounds and are becoming more upper middle class, and then what class are they? I mean, there are a lot of people who've written about this, about kind of like, but are there parts of the, who they were and what they've gotten from their families that just carries forward regardless of how much money they make, and so I think class is way more complicated than income, and and I do try to talk about that some, in the book, and it's interesting that you mentioned this sending money home, because I'm doing a special topics course now with a Questbridge student, and this is a database that brings low income students to Amherst, and and he's very interested in interviewing other low incomes as part of his special topics, other low income students on this campus in terms of how to make things better here for them, and And one of his questions when he made up his interview is, are you sending money home? And I think the truth of the matter is, I've had many students over the years that talk to me. They go home and they're, and they have to pay for the groceries and the diapers, and because they're the only one with any money. And this is, they're in a very difficult situation if they're getting this aid from Amherst, and then, their parent, their families are really, really going under. So yeah. Maybe we'll end there. Sorry, I didn't get to your question. But, thank you.